Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest. When a wife becomes inconvenient, what lengths will a man go to be free of her? Sheriff Amos Gentry thinks he knows. In 1890s Arizona, he wheels his disabled wife Lenora into the desert and leaves her to die. He rides away believing no one saw his terrible act. But mountain man Thaddeus Cole watches everything from the cliffs above. The 70-year-old hermit has avoided people for decades after failing to save his own sister. This time, he won't walk away. He rescues Lenora and brings her to his hidden home in the mountains. As she heals, something powerful grows between them. Now she's ready to return and face the man who threw her away. What will happen when Amos discovers his wife is very much alive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Red Mesa, Arizona territory, painting the adobe buildings in hues of gold and amber. It was 1894, and the frontier was slowly giving way to civilization, though traces of the old ways lingered like ghosts in the desert wind. Sheriff Amos Gentry adjusted his badge, a tarnished piece of tin that had lost much of its original shine, as he stepped onto the wooden boardwalk outside his office. At 43, he carried himself with the practiced authority of a man who had worn the star for nearly a decade. Yet something hollow lurked behind his steady gaze. The badge caught the light as he moved, reflecting not just the sun, but years of compromise, small corruptions, and the gradual erosion of whatever principles had once guided him to law enforcement. To the townspeople of Red Mesa, Sheriff Gentry represented order and respectability. They saw a man who kept the peace, settled disputes, and maintained the delicate balance between the lawless elements that still drifted through and the growing desire for civilized society. What they couldn't see was the ledger hidden in his desk drawer, filled with carefully doctored numbers that masked his systematic theft from the town's development fund. What they couldn't know was how he lay awake at night, calculating how much longer he could maintain the fiction of his integrity. While the weight of his crimes pressed down upon his chest like a stone, Red Mesa itself was a town caught between two worlds. The old territorial buildings stood alongside newer constructions funded by mining speculation and railroad money. Decent families had begun to settle, drawn by promises of prosperity and stability. The schoolhouse, built just 3 years prior, stood as a testament to their faith in the future. Its bell tower rose above the surrounding structures, a symbol of civilization's march across the wilderness. It was in this schoolhouse that Lenora Gentry had once taught, before the accident that changed everything. Before the day 18 months ago, when her horse had been spooked by a rattlesnake and thrown her against the rocks near Willow Creek. Before the doctor's grim pronouncement that she would never walk again. Lenora had been 28 then, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight and eyes the color of sage after rain. She possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that drew people to her, an ability to listen that made even the most reluctant child eager to learn. The schoolhouse had been her domain, where she transformed young minds and planted seeds of knowledge that would grow long after her students had forgotten the shape of their letters. Now, at 30, she spent her days in the wheelchair Amos had reluctantly purchased from a traveling merchant. The device was crude but functional, a wooden seat mounted on wheels with leather straps and iron fittings that spoke more to utility than comfort. To Amos, it had become a symbol of burden, a constant reminder of obligations he never wanted to shoulder. Their marriage had never been a love match, more a practical arrangement between two people who found themselves alone in a harsh land. Amos had needed respectability, and Lenora had needed security. For a time, it had been enough. She brought intelligence and grace to his life, while he provided protection and social standing. But the accident had shattered more than just her spine. It had revealed the shallow, foundation upon which their union rested. In the months following her injury, Amos had watched the town's sympathy gradually shift from active support to polite distance. Visitors became less frequent. Invitations to social gatherings dwindled. The burden of Lenora's care fell increasingly upon him, and he resented each task, each accommodation, each reminder of what their life had become. The financial pressure made everything worse. Town funds that should have gone to infrastructure and development found their way into Amos's personal accounts, financing his growing need for escape gambling, drinking, and the occasional visit to less reputable establishments in larger towns. Each theft required greater care to conceal. Each lie demanded more elaborate supporting deceptions. Lenora, meanwhile, had not remained ignorant of her husband's changing nature. From her wheelchair, she observed the subtle signs of his corruption with the same keen attention she had once devoted to understanding her students. She noticed the discrepancies in his stories, the unexplained absences, the way his eyes darted away when discussing town business. Her teacher's instincts for detecting dishonesty had not dimmed with her mobility. High above Red Mesa, in the rugged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, another story unfolded in solitude. Thaddeus Cole had been watching the town below for nearly 20 years, though few of its inhabitants knew of his existence. At 71, he embodied the mountain itself, weathered, enduring, shaped by forces both gentle and violent. His homestead lay hidden in a box canyon, accessible only through a narrow defile that could easily be missed by anyone not specifically seeking it. The cabin he had built with his own hands nestled against a natural shelf of rock, sheltered from the worst of the mountain weather, yet positioned to command a view of the entire valley below. A small spring provided fresh water year-round, and his carefully tended garden supplied vegetables to supplement the game he hunted. Thaddeus had come to the mountains as a younger man, driven by grief and guilt over his failure to protect his sister Sarah from the violence that had claimed her life. She had been 17, full of hope and dreams, when drifters had attacked their family's homestead back in Kansas. He had been away, hunting for meat to see them through the winter. When the attack occurred, by the time he returned, Sarah lay dead, her dreams scattered like autumn leaves in the wind. The locket she had worn, a worn in May, simple silver piece containing a pressed flower from their mother's garden, now hung around his neck, a constant reminder of his failure and a promise to never again turn away when innocence faced cruelty. He had carried that promise westward, seeking isolation where his failures could harm no one else. Yet isolation had not brought peace. Through his spyglass, a tool salvaged from his days as an army scout, Thaddeus observed the comings and goings of Red Mesa with the detached interest of a man watching actors on a distant stage. He saw the patterns of human behavior play out in miniature below the kindnesses and cruelties, the lies and truths, the endless dance of people trying to build lives in an unforgiving land. He had watched Lenora teaching her students in the schoolyard, noting her patience and gentleness. He had observed the slow dissolution of her marriage as Amos's true nature gradually revealed itself. From his perch among the rocks, Thaddeus saw what the townspeople missed, the subtle signs of a man losing his moral bearings, the incremental steps toward damnation that seemed so small individually, but added up to a terrible sum. On this particular morning, as Sheriff Gentry prepared to make the decision that would define both their lives, neither man fully understood how their paths would intersect. Amos saw only his immediate problems and the desperate solution forming in his mind. Thaddeus saw only another day of solitary observation, another opportunity to bear witness to human folly from a safe distance. The desert stretched between the town and the mountains, a vast expanse of sage, cactus, and ancient stones that had watched countless dramas unfold beneath the merciless sun. It was a place where truth and lies meant nothing to the landscape itself, where actions carried consequences regardless of intent, and where the desert kept its secrets until someone with the courage to seek them demanded answers. In her small house behind the sheriff's office, Lenora sat in her wheelchair before the window, watching the familiar rhythms of morning in Red Mesa. She could no longer teach, but she had not stopped learning. The ledger she had discovered in Amos's desk lay hidden beneath her sewing, its damning entries memorized down to the last stolen dollar. She knew her husband's crimes, understood his growing desperation, and recognized the danger that desperation posed. What she could not yet imagine was that this knowledge would soon become both her death sentence and her salvation, setting in motion events that would reveal the true character of every soul involved. The morning sun continued its ancient arc across the sky, indifferent to human plans and schemes, while 3 lives approached a moment that would change them all forever. The morning that changed everything began with deceptive normalcy. Amos entered their small kitchen, where Lenora sat at the table, her wheelchair positioned to allow her to prepare simple meals. She looked up from slicing apples, her sage-colored eyes meeting his with the wariness that had become habitual between them. "The town council wants to meet with me today," Amos said, his voice carefully neutral, "about the development fund disbursements." Lenora's hands stilled on the knife. She had been expecting this moment for weeks, ever since she discovered the altered ledger entries. "I see," she replied quietly. "There are questions about some of the numbers. People getting suspicious about spending they can't account for." Amos poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "You haven't spoken to anyone about town business, have you?" The question carried an undercurrent of threat that made Lenora's skin prickle with warning. Who would I speak to, Amos? "You know, I rarely see anyone these days." It was true, and they both knew it. The isolation that had gradually settled around their household had served his purposes well, keeping her away from potential allies or confidants. But Amos had made a crucial error. He had underestimated his wife's intelligence and determination. "Good," he said, though his relief seemed forced. "That's good. Because if the wrong information got out, it could destroy everything we've built here." Lenora studied her husband's face, seeing the desperation he tried to hide behind authority. She had loved him once, or thought she had. Now she saw him clearly, a man who had traded his integrity for convenience, piece by piece, until nothing remained but fear and the willingness to do anything to preserve his facade. "Amos," she said carefully, "whatever trouble you're in, perhaps honesty would serve better than—" "I'm not in any trouble," he snapped, then caught himself. "Everything's fine. The books balance. It's just small-minded people asking questions they have no business asking." But Lenora had seen the ledger. She knew exactly how much money had been stolen, and she knew that when the council examined the records properly, the theft would be undeniable. Her husband was not just a criminal. He was a desperate criminal who had run out of options. After breakfast, Amos surprised her by suggesting they take a ride into the desert. "The doctor said you needed more fresh air," he explained, though. No doctor had said any such thing. "The wheelchair fits well enough in the wagon. We could visit some of the old mining claims, see the country." Lenora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. In 18 months of marriage to a disabled woman, Amos had never once suggested an outing for her benefit. Every instinct screamed danger, but she found herself nodding agreement. Perhaps it was curiosity about his true intentions, or perhaps some deeper understanding that running from this moment would only delay the inevitable. They loaded her wheelchair into the back of the wagon. While the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, Amos seemed almost cheerful as they drove out of town, pointing out landmarks and making conversation about the weather. To anyone watching, they might have appeared to be a caring husband taking his disabled wife for a therapeutic ride. The desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and merciless under the climbing sun. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels, their arms raised in permanent supplication to the sky. The mountains rose in the distance, purple-hazed and mysterious, holding secrets in their hidden canyons and shadowed valleys dot as they traveled deeper into the wasteland. Amos's cheerful mask began to slip. His conversation became stilted then, ceased entirely. The only sounds were the creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth. Finally, after what felt like hours, Amos pulled the wagon to a stop beside a cluster of barrel cacti. The isolation was complete. No roads, no buildings, no sign of human presence, except for the tracks they had made getting there. "Here's good," Amos said, not meeting her eyes. "You can see the mountains real clear from here." He lifted her wheelchair from the wagon bed with mechanical efficiency, then carried her from the wagon seat to the chair. The canteen he placed beside her was perhaps half full, enough water for a few hours in this heat, but not enough for survival. "Amos," Lenora said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest, "what are we doing here?" For a moment, he couldn't look at her. When he finally raised his eyes, she saw something that chilled her more than hatred or anger ever could complete emotional emptiness. "I'm sorry, Lenora. I truly am. But I can't carry you anymore. The council's going to discover the missing money, and when they do, I need to be free to handle it. A man with a disabled wife is trapped. A widower has options." The words hung between them like a death sentence. Lenora stared at the man she had married, searching for any trace of the person she thought she had known. "You're going to leave me here to die. I'm going to tell them you wanted to see the desert, that the wheelchair got stuck, and when I tried to free it, you fell and hit your head on the rocks, that you died instantly, without suffering." His voice remained emotionless, as if he were reciting a shopping list. "It'll be a tragic accident. People will sympathize with the grieving widower. And the money you've stolen? What money? A bereaved man might make small errors in bookkeeping, nothing criminal. Nothing that can't be explained by grief and distraction." Lenora realized with horrible clarity that he had planned this carefully. The isolated location, the cover story, even the timing, everything calculated to give him the best chance of escaping consequences for his crimes. "There's just one problem with your plan," she said quietly. "What's that?" "I know about the ledger. Amos, I've seen the real numbers. I know exactly how much you've stolen and how you've hidden it." His face went white. "You're lying. $18,437 over the past 14 months. Hidden in accounts under false names in Tucson and Phoenix. I memorized every entry while you were out drinking away your guilt." For a moment she thought he might reconsider. The plan was flawed if she carried that knowledge to her. Grave suspicions might still fall on him even after her death. But then his expression hardened into something that barely looked human. "Then I guess I'll just have to make sure your accident looks convincing enough that nobody bothers to investigate too closely." He turned toward the wagon without another word, leaving her sitting in her wheelchair beside the barrel cacti with a half-empty canteen and the knowledge that no one would come looking for her in time. "Help will come," he called back to her as he climbed onto the wagon seat. "I'll send someone as soon as I get back to town. Just stay put and try to stay in the shade." The lie was delivered with such casual cruelty that it took Lenora's breath away. She watched him turn the wagon around and head back toward Red Mesa, never once looking over his shoulder at the woman he had condemned to death. But Amos Gentry had made one crucial error in his calculations. High above in the red rock cliffs that overlooked this stretch of desert, an old mountain man had been tracking the wagon through his spyglass, wondering why the sheriff was taking his disabled wife so far from town on such a brutally hot day. Thaddeus Cole had witnessed the entire exchange, and for the first time in 20 years, he could not simply observe and do nothing. Thaddeus Cole's hand shook as he lowered the spyglass, not from age or infirmity, but from the rage that coursed through his weathered frame. 20 years of self-imposed isolation had not dulled his ability to recognize evil when he witnessed it, and what he had just seen through the lens was evil in its purest form, the deliberate abandonment of an innocent soul to a cruel death. His fingers found the silver locket at his throat. Sarah's locket, and for a moment he was 17 years old again, returning from a hunting trip to find his sister's broken body and the smoking remains of their family home. The guilt that had driven him into these mountains crashed over him with renewed force, but this time it carried a different message. This time he could act. The descent from his perch among the red rocks was treacherous, but Thaddeus had been navigating these cliffs for 2 decades. His mule, a sturdy animal named Jeremiah, waited patiently where he had tethered him in a grove of scrub oak. The beast seemed to sense his master's urgency, offering no resistance as Thaddeus secured his supplies and began the careful journey down toward the desert floor. Every minute counted now. The sun was climbing higher, and even in late autumn, the desert heat could kill a person in hours. Thaddeus pushed Jeremiah as hard as he dared across the rocky terrain, following game trails and dry washes that offered the fastest route to where he had seen the sheriff abandon his wife as he rode. Memories flooded back, not just of Sarah, but of other moments when he might have acted and chose safety instead. A Navajo family harassed by drifters while he watched from hiding. A Mexican boy beaten by drunken miners while Thaddeus remained concealed in the rocks above. Each time he had told himself that interfering would only bring trouble to his own doorstep, that the hermit's life required avoiding such entanglements. But Sarah's locket seemed to grow heavier against his chest with each remembered failure, each moment when he had chosen his own peace over another's suffering. Today would be different. It had to be. When he finally reached the spot where the abandonment had occurred, he found Lenora exactly as her husband had left her, sitting upright in her wheelchair, her face turned toward the mountains as if she had sensed help might come from that direction. The canteen sat beside her, open but barely touched. She was rationing her water, he realized, fighting for survival, even in the face of seemingly hopeless circumstances. Thaddeus approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. At the sound of Jeremiah's hooves on the rocky ground, Lenora turned, her sage-colored eyes widening at the sight of the grizzled stranger emerging from the desert heat, shimmer like a mirage. "Ma'am," Thaddeus said, touching the brim of his weathered hat, "I saw what happened. Saw your husband leave you here." Lenora studied this unexpected savior with the same careful attention she had once devoted to evaluating new students. He was tall and lean, with silver hair that reached his shoulders and skin darkened by decades under the desert sun. His clothes were simple but well-maintained: buckskin shirt, canvas pants, boots that had seen hard use but were carefully repaired. Most telling were his eyes, pale blue and haunted, carrying the weight of old sorrows. "You've been watching from the mountains," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. 20 years now. Saw you teaching those children. Saw how gentle you were with them. Saw how things changed after your accident, how he started treating you." Thaddeus's voice carried a roughness that suggested long disuse, words spoken more to himself than to others. "I should have acted before now. Why didn't you?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. He had expected gratitude, fear, or simple relief, not this quiet challenge that demanded honesty. "Because I'm a coward," he said finally. "Because 20 years ago I failed someone who counted on me, and I've been hiding from that failure ever since." Lenora considered this admission with the same gravity she might have given to a student's confession of wrongdoing. "But you're here now." "Yes, ma'am, I'm here now." Thaddeus dismounted and approached her wheelchair, noting how the crude construction must make every movement painful. "We need to get you out of this sun. My place isn't far, but the way's rough. You going to be able to hold on if I rig something to carry you?" I've held on this long, Lenora replied with quiet strength. I think I can manage a little longer. Working. Quickly, Thaddeus fashioned a travois from deadwood and rope, creating a platform stable enough to transport the wheelchair. It was crude, but functional, much like everything else in his mountain existence. As he worked, Lenora watched his hands, noting their steadiness despite his age, the efficient movements that spoke of long experience with makeshift solutions. What's your name? She asked as he secured the wheelchair to the improvised carrier. Thaddeus. Cole. Most folks just call me Cole when they remember I exist at all. I'm Lenora Gentry. Though I suppose after today, I'm not sure what name I should be using. Thaddeus paused in his work, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. The woman her husband had tried to murder no longer existed in any legal sense. MS would report her dead. Probably was already crafting the story of her tragic accident. Whatever came next, she would be living outside the boundaries of her former life. Names are just labels, he said gently. What matters is who you choose to be from here forward. The journey to his hidden canyon took the better part of 2 hours. Following paths so faint, they were barely visible to anyone not intimately familiar with the terrain. Jeremiah picked his way carefully over loose stone and around thorny obstacles, while Thaddeus walked alongside, steadying the travois. When the going got particularly rough, Lenora endured the jarring ride without complaint, though Thaddeus could see the strain it caused her. Several times he offered to stop and rest, but she declined, seeming to understand as well as he did that every moment in the open desert increased their danger. Finally, they reached a narrow defile that served as the only entrance to his sanctuary. The opening was so narrow that the travois barely fit through, and so well concealed that it appeared to be nothing more than a shadow in the rock face. Beyond lay a hidden world that few human eyes had ever seen. The box canyon opened into a natural amphitheater, perhaps a quarter-mile across, with sheer walls rising hundreds of feet on all sides. A spring bubbled from the rocks near the back wall, feeding a small stream that supported cottonwoods and wild grasses. The cabin Thaddeus had built nestled against the eastern wall, positioned to catch the morning sun while remaining shaded during the brutal afternoon heat dawn. It was beautiful in its isolation, a place where time seemed to move differently, where the concerns of the outside world felt distant and unimportant. For the first time since her husband's betrayal, Lenora felt something approaching peace. Welcome to nowhere, Thaddeus said, helping her from the travois to her wheelchair. It's not much, but it's safe. As he spoke those words, something in his expression shifted. For 20 years, he had guarded this refuge jealously, sharing it with no one, using its isolation as both sanctuary and prison. Now, for the first time, he was welcoming another soul into his carefully constructed solitude, and the simple act felt like the beginning of his own redemption. Back in Red Mesa, Sheriff Amos Gentry played his role with the studied precision of a man whose life depended on the performance. He returned to town in the late afternoon, his face appropriately grave, his manner that of a husband struck by sudden tragedy. He went first to Doc Henley's office, where he found the elderly physician tending to a minor injury. Doc, Amos said, his voice catching just enough to sound authentic. I need you to come with me. There's been an accident. Doctor. Henley looked up from bandaging a child's scraped knee, immediately noting the sheriff's distressed appearance. What kind of accident? It's Lenora. We went out to the desert. Thought the fresh air might do her some good. The wheelchair got stuck on some rocks, and when I tried to free it, Amos allowed his voice to break convincingly. She fell. Hit her head hard. By the time I could get to her, she was gone. The doctor's expression shifted to one of professional concern mixed with genuine sympathy. Where is she now? I couldn't move her alone, not safely. I came back for help. Amos gestured toward the door. We need to go quickly, Doc. Before the desert heat, Dr. Henley was already reaching for his medical bag. Of course. Let me get. I thinks. As they prepared to leave, word of the tragedy began to spread through Red Mesa with the efficiency that characterized all news in small communities. By the time Amos and the doctor departed with a wagon to retrieve Lenora's body, a small crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office, their faces showing the mix of shock and sympathy that accompanies unexpected loss. Meanwhile, in the hidden sanctuary of Thaddeus's canyon, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Lenora sat in her wheelchair beside the small cabin, watching her rescuer move with quiet efficiency as he prepared a simple meal over his outdoor fire pit. The teaching slate she had managed to save from her possessions lay across her lap, a remnant of her former life that suddenly felt like a bridge to something new. "You don't have to take care of me," she said as Thaddeus approached with a tin plate of beans and cornbread. "I can manage for myself." "I'm sure you can," he replied, settling onto a wooden stump he had fashioned into a crude chair. "But there's no shame in accepting help when it's freely offered." They ate in comfortable silence as the sun began its descent behind the canyon walls. The isolation that might have felt oppressive under different circumstances instead provided a sense of safety, a place where the outside world's expectations and judgments couldn't reach. "Tell me about your sister," Lenora said eventually, having noted how his hand unconsciously moved to the locket at his throat whenever he seemed lost in thought. Thaddeus stiffened slightly, then forced himself to relax. If he was going to share his sanctuary with another person, perhaps it was time to share some of the burdens he had carried alone for so long. Her name was Sarah. She was 17 when she died, full of dreams about the life she was going to build. Smart as a whip, could read better than most adults. She wanted to be a teacher, like you. What happened to her? Drifters came through. While I was hunting, 3 men looking for easy pickings. They found our cabin, found Sarah alone. His voice grew quiet, distant. When I got back, the cabin was burned and she was gone. Took me 2 days to track them down. Lenora waited, understanding that some stories needed time and space to emerge. "I killed them," Thaddeus continued matter-of-factly. "All 3, but it didn't bring her back, didn't ease the guilt of leaving her unprotected. So I came west, looking for a place where my failures couldn't hurt anyone else. And yet here you are, having saved me." "Here I am," he agreed. "Makes a man wonder about the patterns life follows, doesn't it?" As the days passed in the canyon, they settled into a routine that served both their needs. Thaddeus taught Lenora about mountain survival, how to identify edible plants, how to read weather patterns in the sky, how to move quietly through terrain that could betray the unwary. In return, she shared stories of her teaching days, bringing back memories of laughter and learning that the canyon hadn't heard in 2 decades. Her wheelchair, crude as it was, proved more adaptable than either had expected. Thaddeus fashioned modifications, using materials at hand leather straps for better support, wooden blocks to level the seat, even a small platform that could be attached to help her reach higher shelves in the cabin. Each improvement was made in response to watching her struggle with some daily task. Each modification offered but the quiet respect of one survivor helping another. "You're very good at solving problems," Lenora observed one evening as they sat by the fire, watching stars emerge in the narrow strip of sky visible above the canyon walls. "Had to be, living up here alone. Mountain doesn't care if you're having a bad day. It'll kill you just the same if you make the wrong choices. Is that why you've stayed so long? Because it was safer to face the mountain's challenges than people's?" Thaddeus considered her question seriously. "People are unpredictable. Mountains just are what they are. You know where you stand with a mountain. And with people? With people, you can think you know someone for years and then discover they're capable of things you never imagined." The pain in his voice spoke not just of his sister's death, but of his own isolation, the gradual erosion of trust that had driven him into hermitage. Lenora understood that feeling intimately. Her marriage to Amos had taught her how thoroughly one person could deceive another, how completely the face someone showed the world could mask their true nature. "But people are also capable of unexpected kindness," she said gently. "Unexpected courage. A hermit could risk his safety to save a stranger, for instance." Thaddeus looked at her across the firelight, seeing not the broken victim he had rescued, but a woman whose spirit had proved stronger than the cruelty that had tried to destroy her. In her steady gaze, he found something he had not dared hope. For in 20 years, the possibility of redemption, not just for past failures, but for the choice to remain isolated when he might have helped others. "Maybe," he said quietly, "maybe that's true." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering and human hope alike, while two wounded souls began the delicate process of learning to trust again. The ledger lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Amos Gentry's office, its pages filled with the careful documentation of his systematic theft from Red Mess's development fund. Each entry represented another step away from the man he had once pretended to be, another compromise with the darkness that had gradually consumed his integrity. Since Lenora's supposed death 3 weeks earlier, Amos had found himself checking the hiding place obsessively, as if the physical evidence of his crimes might somehow disappear if he willed it strongly enough. But the numbers remained unchanged: $18,437 stolen over 14 months, hidden in accounts under false names in distant towns. The investigation into Lenora's accident had been perfunctory, exactly as he had planned. Doc Henley had examined the body Amos claimed to have found, noting the head injury consistent with a fall against desert rocks. The wheelchair had been damaged appropriately, its crude wheels bent as if it had indeed become stuck and overturned during an attempt to free it. Yet despite the apparent success of his deception, Amos found no peace. The townspeople's sympathy felt like acid on his conscience, their kind words about his tragic loss serving as constant reminders of the enormity of what he had done. He caught himself looking over his shoulder constantly, jumping at unexpected sounds, starting awake from nightmares where Lenora's accusing eyes followed him through endless corridors of guilt. The town council had postponed their financial review out of respect for his bereavement, but Amos knew the reprieve was temporary. Soon they would want to examine the books, and when they did, even his careful manipulations might not withstand close scrutiny. The weight of living a lie while maintaining the facade of a grieving husband was taking its toll, visible in the hollows beneath his eyes and the tremor in his hands when he thought no one was watching. Meanwhile, high in the mountain sanctuary, Lenora was discovering strengths she never knew she possessed. The harsh beauty of the canyon had become her classroom, with Thaddeus as her patient instructor in the skills necessary for survival in this unforgiving landscape. "The key," he explained as they examined the contents of his small garden, "is understanding what the land offers and what it demands in return. Nothing here grows without purpose, and nothing survives without adaptation." Lenora studied the carefully tended rows of beans, squash, and corn that comprised his modest agricultural effort. The garden was positioned to catch morning sun while remaining shaded during the brutal afternoon heat, irrigated by a clever system of channels that directed water from the spring to each plant's roots without waste. "You've made this place into a haven," she observed, noting how every element served multiple purposes. "But it must have been lonely, building it all for yourself." "Loneliness was the price I thought I had to pay," Thaddeus admitted, kneeling to check the soil moisture around a particularly promising squash plant. "Seemed safer to hurt from isolation than to risk failing someone else. And now?" He looked at her sitting in her modified wheelchair, noting how the mountain air had brought color back to her cheeks and how her eyes had lost the haunted quality they carried when he first found her in the desert. Now I'm wondering if safety was worth the cost. Their evening routine had evolved into something approaching domesticity, though neither would have used that word to describe it. Thaddeus cooked over the outdoor fire pit while Lenora prepared vegetables, their conversation ranging from practical matters of survival to deeper questions about the nature of justice and forgiveness. "What will you do when you're strong enough to leave?" Thaddeus asked one evening as they watched the last light fade from the canyon walls. Lenora had been expecting this question for days, had been wrestling with it herself as her physical strength returned and her emotional wounds began to heal. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Legally, I'm dead." The woman who taught school in Red Mesa, who married Amos Gentry, who tried to live a quiet, respectable life, she died in that desert. "I'm not sure who I am now." "You're someone who survived what should have killed her. Someone who refused to give up even when she had every reason to quit. That's not nothing. It's not enough either." She turned to face him in the firelight, her expression serious. "He can't be allowed to get away with what he's done, Thaddeus. Not just to me, but to the town that trusted him. The money he's stolen was meant to build schools, improve roads, help families get established. His crimes hurt more than just me." Thaddeus understood the weight of her words. In his years of mountain solitude, he had observed Red Mesa's gradual growth and development, had seen how carefully the community balanced progress with fiscal responsibility. The theft of development funds wasn't just a crime against the town's treasury. It was a betrayal of their shared hopes for the future. Confronting him would be dangerous, he said quietly. He's already proved he's willing to kill to protect himself. Going back to Red Mesa, revealing that you're alive, that would put you at tremendous risk. Living safely while evil goes unpunished isn't really living at all, Lenora replied. You taught me that, though perhaps not in words. Thaddeus felt the truth of her statement like a physical weight in his chest. For 20 years, he had chosen safety over action, solitude over engagement, withdrawal over the risk of failing someone else. But watching Lenora's transformation from victim to survivor had forced him to examine his own choices with uncomfortable clarity. If you're determined to face him, he said finally, you won't face him alone. The words surprised them both. Thaddeus had not planned to offer such support, had not consciously decided to emerge from his self-imposed exile. Yet the promise felt right, felt like the completion of something that had begun the moment he chose to rescue her from the desert. Why? Lenora asked simply. Thaddeus touched the silver locket at his throat, feeling the familiar weight of his sister's memory. Because 20 years ago, I failed someone who needed my protection. Because I've spent 2 decades hiding from the world instead of trying to make it better. Because watching you refuse to accept injustice has reminded me of who I used to be, before fear made me into a coward. Above them, the desert wind sang through the canyon's stone walls, carrying with it the promise of change. 2 people who had been discarded by the world they once knew were beginning to forge something new, not just a plan for survival, but a commitment to justice that would require them to risk everything they have found in their mountain refuge. The first snows of winter dusted the high peaks surrounding Thaddeus's canyon, transforming the rugged landscape into something almost ethereal in its beauty. The change of seasons brought both challenges and opportunities, harsh weather that would test their preparations, but also the kind of isolation that would allow them to plan without fear of discovery. In the months since her rescue, Lenora had undergone a transformation that went far beyond physical recovery. The woman who had once moved through Red Mesa with quiet dignity, accepting the limitations placed upon her by both her disability and society's expectations, had been replaced by someone harder, more determined, shaped by survival, and tempered by injustice. Thaddeus had given her Sarah's rifle a lever action, Winchester that his sister had learned to use with deadly accuracy before her death. The weapon felt strange in Lenora's hands at first. its weight and purpose alien to someone who had spent her life nurturing young minds rather than contemplating violence. It's not about wanting to hurt anyone, Thaddeus explained as they practiced among the rocks near the back of the canyon. It's about having options when words aren't enough. The rifle's stock was worn smooth by decades of handling, first by Sarah's small hands, then by Thaddeus during his years of solitary hunting. Now it was passing to another woman who might need its protection, carrying with it the weight of memory and the promise of justice. "Tell me again about the night she died," Lenora said, as they cleaned the rifle after practice. It had become a ritual between them, this sharing of painful memories, as if speaking the truth aloud might somehow lessen its power to wound. "I should have been there," Thaddeus began, his voice carrying the familiar cadence of a story told many times to an audience of one. "Should have known that leaving her alone was asking for trouble. The frontier was no place for a young woman to be unprotected, but I thought," he paused, struggling with the same guilt that had driven him into exile. "I thought providing food was more important than providing safety." "You were 17 years old," Lenora reminded him gently. "You were trying to take care of your family the only way you knew how. Age doesn't excuse failure." "No," she agreed, "but it explains it. And understanding is the first step toward forgiveness of others and ourselves." Their conversations had taken on this quality of mutual confession. Two people who had been wounded by life sharing their scars and finding unexpected healing in the sharing. Thaddeus learned about Lenora's childhood dreams of making a difference through education, her hopes for a family that never came, her gradual realization that her marriage to Amos was built on convenience rather than love. "I kept telling myself that respect could grow into affection," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, "that a practical partnership could become something deeper if I just tried hard enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough. And instead I discovered that some people see kindness as weakness, see sacrifice as something they're owed rather than something to be treasured." In Red Mesa, Amos's behavior had become increasingly erratic. The pressure of maintaining his facade while hiding his crimes was wearing at his sanity like water wearing at stone. He drank more, slept less, and jumped at shadows that might have been nothing or might have been the approaching footsteps of justice. The town council had finally rescheduled their financial review, and despite Amos's attempts to delay the inevitable, the date was set for early spring. He had spent weeks doctoring records, creating false receipts, and building elaborate explanations for discrepancies that any careful auditor would spot within hours. More troubling were the questions some of the townspeople had begun asking about Lenora's death. Nothing specific, nothing that suggested outright suspicion, but small inconsistencies that nagged at observant minds. Why had Amos taken his disabled wife so far into the desert? Why hadn't he brought help with him for such an ambitious outing? Why did his grief seem so performative, so calculated? Doc Henley, in particular, had grown thoughtful about the case. As a man of science, he was trained to observe details, and some of the details about Lenora's supposed accident didn't align perfectly with the story he had been told. The angle of the head wound, the position of the overturned wheelchair, the fact that Amos seemed remarkably composed for a man who had just witnessed his wife's accidental death. All of it created a pattern that suggested careful staging rather than genuine tragedy. But suspicion was not proof, and Doc Henley was reluctant to voice concerns that might destroy a man's reputation based on nothing more than medical intuition. Still, he found himself watching Amos more carefully, noting the sheriff's increasing nervousness and the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking. High in the mountains, unaware of the growing scrutiny facing her supposed murderer, Lenora was making plans of her own. The woman who had once accepted limitation and adapted to circumstances beyond her control was learning to shape events, rather than merely endure them. "When we go back," she said to Thaddeus one evening as they reviewed the layout of Red Mesa by firelight, It can't be about revenge. It has to be about justice. What's the difference? Revenge is about making him pay for what he did to me. Justice is about making sure he faces the consequences of all his crimes, and that the people he betrayed get their money back. Thaddeus studied the rough map they had drawn together, noting the locations of key buildings, escape routes, and potential allies. Justice requires witnesses, evidence, legal process. Revenge just requires a gun and the willingness to use it. Then we'll have to find witnesses and gather evidence. That could take months, maybe years, and that's what it takes. Lenora's voice carried a determination that had been forged in the crucible of abandonment and tempered by months of survival. I won't become what he is, Thaddeus. I won't let his evil turn me into something I can't live with. As winter deepened around their canyon sanctuary, they continued their preparations, not for a violent confrontation, but for something far more difficult and dangerous. They were planning to restore a dead woman to life, to resurrect Lenora Gentry from her desert grave and force her killer to face the consequences of his crimes in the full light of day. It would require patience, courage, and a willingness to risk everything they had built in their mountain refuge. But it was the right thing to do, and both of them had learned that doing the right thing, regardless of cost, was the only way to live with honor in an often dishonorable world. The letter arrived in Red Mesa on a Tuesday morning in early March, carried by a freight wagon driver who had picked up mail from the territorial capital. Doc Henley was tending to a rancher's broken arm when his assistant brought him the envelope, its edges worn from travel and bearing the shaky handwriting of a man unused to forming words on paper. "Doc," the assistant said, noting the serious expression on the envelope's exterior. "This one's marked urgent. Says it's about a witness to something important." Dr. Henley set down his medical instruments and opened the letter carefully. What? A read inside changed everything he thought he knew about Lenora Gentry's death, and cast the entire tragedy in a completely different light. The letter was from Jakub Kowalski, a Polish prospector who had been working claims in the desert east of Red Mesa for the past 3 years. Jakub was dying. Consumption had taken hold of his lungs, and he knew he had only weeks left to live. But before he met his maker, he wrote, he needed to unburden his conscience about something he had witnessed months earlier. "I seen what really happened to the sheriff's wife." The letter began in broken English that reflected Jakob's struggle with his adopted language. "I was working my claim in Skeleton Canyon when I hear wagon coming through the desert. I eyed because sometimes bandits use that route, but when I look, I see it is Sheriff Gentry with his wife in the wheelchair." Doc Henley's hands began to tremble as he continued reading. "He'd take her far from the wagon and leave her there with little water. She tried to call to him, but he don't look back. He just ride away like she was nothing. I want to help her, but I'm afraid of the sheriff, afraid he will say I'm trespassing or worse. I watched from the rocks for a long time, thinking maybe he come back, but he never does." The letter went on to describe how Jakub had waited until nightfall, planning to rescue Lenora himself, only to see another figure emerge from the mountains, a tall man leading a mule, who approached the abandoned woman with obvious caution. "This mountain man, he take her away to safety. I see him load her chair onto something he make from wood and rope. They go up into the high country where I cannot follow. But the woman, she was alive when they leave. Very much alive." Dr. Henley read the final paragraph twice, hardly believing what he was seeing. "I know this make trouble for important man like Sheriff, but I cannot die with this lie on my soul. The woman did not die in accident like he say. He tried to murder her in the desert, and someone else save her life. I write this because maybe she is still alive somewhere, and maybe the truth should be known before I go to meet God." The letter was signed with Jakob's shaky signature and included directions to his camp, along with a note that he was too weak to travel, but would swear to the truth of his statement. before any official who cared to make the journey. Doc Henley sat in his office for a long time after reading the letter, staring at the pages as if they might somehow change their meaning if he looked hard enough. Everything he had accepted about Lenora's death, every sympathy he had offered Amos, every detail of the sheriff's carefully constructed story, all of it was revealed as an elaborate lie built on attempted murder. But the letter raised as many questions as it answered. If Lenora had been rescued, why hadn't she returned? Who was the mountain man who had saved her, and where had he taken her? Was she still alive somewhere in the high country, or had she simply died more slowly than her husband intended? More immediately pressing was the question of what to do with this information. Amos Gentry was not just the sheriff. He was a man who had proved himself capable of murder to protect his secrets. Confronting him directly could be dangerous, not just for Doc Henley, but for anyone else who might have evidence of his crimes. The doctor made his decision with the careful deliberation that characterized all his important choices. He would need help, reliable men who could be trusted with sensitive information and who had the authority to act on it when the time came. He would also need to verify Jakob's story, assuming the prospector lived long enough to give testimony. That afternoon, Doc Henley rode out to the territorial marshal's office in Prescott, carrying Jakob's letter and a detailed account of his own growing suspicions about Lenora's supposed accident. Marshal Williams read the documents with the grim expression of a man who had seen too much human evil to be easily shocked. But even he seemed surprised by the calculated cruelty described in the prospector's testimony. "If this is true, Marshal," Williams said, "we're looking at attempted murder, fraud, and probably theft. A man doesn't abandon his wife unless he's got other crimes to hide. What about the woman? If she's still alive, then she's in danger every day that Gentry walks free," the marshal finished. "We need to move carefully here, Doc. If we spook him, he might run, or he might decide to finish what he started if he can find her." They agreed on a plan that would require patience and careful coordination. Marshal Williams would quietly begin investigating Amos's financial records, looking for the evidence of theft that might explain his desperate actions. Meanwhile, Doc Henley would travel to Jakob's camp to take his formal statement, assuming the dying man was still capable of giving one. The journey to Skeleton Canyon took the better part of 2 days, following rough trails that tested both horse and rider. When Doc Henley finally reached Jakob's crude camp, he found the prospector exactly as described in the letter, dying, but determined to tell his story one final time. Jakob's testimony was even more damning in person than it had been on paper. He had watched Amos's cold abandonment of his wife from a distance of perhaps 50 yards, close enough to see the sheriff's expression as he rode away without looking back. He had witnessed Lenora's rescue by the mysterious mountain man, had seen her wheeled away toward the high country on a makeshift travois. "She fight to live," Jakob told the doctor, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even when she think nobody coming to help, she don't give up. That takes strong spirit. Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Jakob's laugh turned into a coughing fit that left specks of blood on his lips. "You think anyone believe old prospector against important sheriff? You think I live long enough to tell story if he know I see what he do?" The prospector died 2 days after giving his statement, taking his secret to the grave exactly as he had planned. But his testimony lived on in Doc Henley's careful notes, witnessed and signed by Marshal Williams, providing the foundation for what would become the most shocking case in Red Mesa's short history. As spring approached and the mountain snows began to melt, the truth that had been buried in the desert was finally beginning to surface. Amos Gentry's carefully constructed lies were about to crumble, and somewhere in the high country, a woman he thought he had murdered was preparing to return from the dead to demand justice. The town bell of Red Mesa rang out across the desert valley on the morning of March 15th, calling the community together for an emergency meeting. The bronze bell, cast in St. Louis and hauled across the wilderness by determined settlers, had rung for celebrations and tragedies alike. But never had it told with such ominous purpose as it did that spring morning. Marshal Williams had arrived in town the previous evening, accompanied by 2 deputies and carrying documents that would shatter the carefully constructed facade that Sheriff Amos Gentry had maintained for months. The marshal had spent the night in quiet consultation with Doc Henley and several prominent townspeople, sharing evidence that painted a picture of corruption and attempted murder that few could have imagined. Amos himself had not slept. From his office window, he had watched the marshal's arrival with growing dread, recognizing in the lawman's purposeful manner the approaching end of his deceptions. The hidden ledger seemed to burn through the floorboards beneath his feet, its damning entries a physical weight that pressed down upon his chest like a stone. When the bell began to ring, Amos knew that his time of reckoning had come. He could run his horse was saddled, his few valuable possessions already packed in saddlebags that waited behind his desk. The territorial border was only a hard day's ride away, and beyond that lay Mexico and the possibility of starting over, with a new name and a fabricated past. But something held him in place as the bell continued its solemn call. Perhaps it was the knowledge that running would only confirm his guilt, or perhaps it was the exhaustion that came from carrying such terrible secrets for so long. Whatever the reason, when Marshal Williams knocked on his office door, Amos was still there to answer. "Sheriff Gentry," the marshal said, his voice formal and carrying the weight of official authority, "I need you to come with me to the community meeting. There are some matters we need to discuss in front of the town." Amos looked into the marshal's eyes and saw his own doom reflected there. What kind of matters? The kind that concerned the theft of public funds and the attempted murder of your wife. The words hit Amos like physical blows, confirming his worst fears while simultaneously bringing a strange sense of relief. The pretense was over. The exhausting performance of grief and respectability could finally end. "I see," Amos said quietly. "And I suppose you have proof of these accusations?" "We have a witness, Sheriff. A man who saw you abandon Mrs. Gentry in the desert and ride away. A man who also saw her rescued alive by someone else." Amos felt the blood drain from his face. In all his careful planning, he had never considered the possibility of witnesses in that vast, empty landscape. The desert had seemed so perfectly isolated, so completely free of human presence. "Who?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Jakub Kowalski, the Polish prospector who worked claims in Skeleton Canyon. He's dead now, but not before giving a full statement about what he witnessed." The walk from the sheriff's office to the community meeting felt like a journey to his own execution. Townspeople lined the streets, their faces showing a mixture of shock, anger, and betrayal that cut through Amos's remaining defenses like a blade. These were people who had trusted him, who had looked to him for protection and justice, who had offered sympathy for his supposed loss. The meeting hall was packed beyond capacity, with more people gathered outside the windows and doors. Marshal Williams had arranged for the most prominent citizens to sit in the front rows. The mayor, the banker, the preacher, the schoolmaster who had taken over Lenora's classroom. Their faces showed the same mixture of disbelief and growing comprehension that Amos had seen on the street. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marshal Williams began, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room, "I've called this meeting to share information about a crime that has gone undetected for nearly 6 months. Information that suggests Sheriff Gentry has betrayed the trust you placed in him in the most fundamental way possible." The marshal's presentation was methodical and devastating. He read Jakob's testimony aloud, describing the abandoned woman in her wheelchair, the sheriff's cold departure, and the mysterious mountain man who had carried her to safety. He presented Doc Henley's growing suspicions about the supposed accident, pointing out medical inconsistencies that suggested careful staging rather than Natural tragedy. But the most damning evidence came when Marshal Williams produced the hidden ledger, discovered during a search of the sheriff's office. The carefully documented theft of town development funds painted a picture of systematic corruption that explained the desperate measures Amos had taken to silence the one person who knew of his crimes. $18,437. The marshal read from the ledger's pages. Stolen over 14 months from funds intended to build schools, improve roads, and help families establish themselves in this community. Money that belonged to all of you, used to finance gambling, drinking, and the lifestyle of a man who had forgotten his oath to serve and protect. The crowd's murmur grew to a roar of outrage as the full scope of Amos's betrayal became clear. This was not just about the attempted murder of his wife. It was about the theft of their shared hopes for the future, the violation of trust that held their community together. "Where is she?" called out Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife who had been one of Lenora's closest friends. "Where's Lenora? If she was rescued, why hasn't she come home?" Marshal Williams held up his hand for quiet. "That, ma'am, is a question we're still trying to answer. The mountain man who rescued her remains unidentified, and we don't know if she's still alive or if she died later from her ordeal." But even as he spoke those words, the marshal's attention was drawn to a commotion at the back of the hall. People were turning in their seats, craning their necks to see something happening outside. Through the open windows came the sound of voices raised in amazement, and then a single clear call that silenced the entire gathering. "Make way. Make way for Mrs. Gentry." The crowd parted like water before the prow ship as two figures approached the meeting hall. The first was a tall, silver-haired man in buckskin clothing, leading a sturdy mule and carrying himself with the quiet dignity of someone unaccustomed to crowds, but determined to see justice done behind him. Seated in a wheelchair that had been modified with obvious care and skill came Lenora Gentry. But this was not the frail, dependent woman who had disappeared into the desert 6 months earlier. This Lenora sat straight and proud, her auburn hair caught back practically, her sage-colored eyes burning with a determination that commanded attention and respect. She wore a simple dress of blue wool that somehow transformed her from victim to moral authority, her very presence in that wheelchair speaking to a strength that transcended physical limitation. In her lap lay a teaching slate, blank but ready to be filled with the lessons that were about to be taught. The silence in the meeting hall was absolute as Lenora's wheelchair was lifted up the front steps by willing hands. Thaddeus Cole followed, his pale blue eyes scanning the crowd with the wariness of someone who had spent decades avoiding such gatherings, but who would not abandon his friend when she needed him most. Amos Gentry stared at his wife as if she were a ghost risen from the grave, which, in a very real sense, she was. The color had drained completely from his face, and his hands shook so violently that he had to clasp them together to maintain any semblance of composure. "Hello, Amos," Lenora said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "I believe we have some things to discuss." The simple blue dress Lenora wore had been sewn during the long winter months in Thaddeus Canyon, each stitch placed with the careful attention of someone preparing for the most important moment of her life. It was not fashionable by the standards of town society, but it possessed a dignity that transformed her from the broken woman Amos had abandoned into something far more powerful, a living testament to the strength of the human spirit. As she sat in her wheelchair before the assembled crowd, every eye in the room fixed upon her with a mixture of wonder and growing comprehension. This was not the dependent, quietly suffering woman they remembered from before her supposed death. This Lenora radiated a quiet authority that commanded attention and respect, her very presence challenging assumptions about what it meant to be whole, what it meant to be strong. 6 months ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hall, my husband took me into the desert under the pretense of a therapeutic ride. He wheeled me to a place so remote that my cries for help could not be heard by anyone. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the crowd, and then he left me there to die. A collective gasp rose from the assembled townspeople, though Marshal Williams had prepared them with Jacob's testimony. Hearing the truth from Lenora's own lips carried a visceral impact that no second-hand account could match. He left me with a half-empty canteen and a lie that help was on the way, that someone would come for me soon. Lenora's eyes found Amos across the room, noting how he seemed to shrink under her steady gaze. But we both knew no help was coming. He'd taken me there to die, and he rode away believing he had solved all his problems. Mrs. Henderson, tears streaming down her cheeks, called out from the crowd, "But how did you survive? How did you get away?" Lenora gestured toward Thaddeus, who stood quietly at the back of the room, uncomfortable with the attention, but resolute in his support. "This man saved my life." Thaddeus Cole saw what happened from the mountains above, and he chose not to look away. When my own husband abandoned me, a stranger showed me the kindness and protection that should have been mine by right. She turned back to address Amos directly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "You thought disposing of me would solve your problems, didn't you, Amos? You thought that with your inconvenient wife dead, you could cover up your theft of the town's money, start fresh, maybe even remarry someone who wouldn't discover your crimes." Amos tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no words came. The carefully constructed lies that had sustained him for months crumbled in the face of his wife's living testimony. "But I didn't die," Lenora continued, her voice now carrying the moral authority of someone who had looked death in the face and refused to submit. "And during the months I spent healing in the mountains, I had plenty of time to think about what kind of man abandons his wife in the desert. What kind of desperation drives a person to attempted murder?" She reached into a pocket of her dress and withdrew a folded paper, a copy of the financial records she had memorized before her abandonment. The answer, of course, was theft. Systematic, calculated theft of money that belonged to this community. Money meant to build schools and roads and help families make better lives. The crowd's murmur grew louder as people began to understand the full scope of Amos's betrayal. This wasn't just about one man's cruelty to his wife. It was about the violation of trust that held their entire community together. "I am not here for revenge," Lenora declared, her voice rising above the growing noise. "I am here for justice. Justice for the money stolen from your children's education, from your roads and bridges, from your hopes for this town's future. Justice for every person who believed in the integrity of the badge this man wore." Amos finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Lenora, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Her interruption cut through his attempted explanation like a blade. "I understand that you are a thief and a would-be murderer. I understand that you use my disability as an excuse to isolate me from friends who might have helped me, from a community that might have protected me. I understand that you saw my condition not as something that required patience and accommodation, but as a burden to be disposed of when it became inconvenient." The power of her words, delivered with such calm certainty, reduced Amos to silence. Around the room, faces that had shown him sympathy and respect for months now reflected disgust and betrayal. The facade he had so carefully maintained was not just cracking, it was completely destroyed. But most of all, Lenora concluded, "I understand that a person's worth is not measured by their physical abilities, and that someone in a wheelchair can be just as strong, just as determined, and just as capable of seeking justice as anyone else in this room." The sound of horses approaching at a gallop interrupted the tense confrontation in the meeting hall. Through the open windows came the distinctive rhythm of a judicial escort, the circuit judge arriving for what would become the most important legal proceeding in Red Mesa's brief history. Judge Harrison Blackwood was a man whose reputation preceded him across the territory. Tall and austere, with silver hair and keen gray eyes, he had spent 20 years bringing law to frontier settlements, where justice often came at the end of a rope rather than through careful deliberation. The wooden gavel he carried was more than a symbol. It was a tool that had shaped the legal landscape of the American West. As the judge entered the crowded hall, his presence immediately changed the dynamics of the confrontation. What had been a community gathering fueled by shock and outrage now took on the formal weight of legal proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I understand. There are serious allegations to be addressed here. Marshal Williams has briefed me on the situation, and I am prepared to conduct preliminary hearings immediately." The judge's gaze swept the room, taking in the packed crowd, the obvious tension, and the central figures in the drama. When his eyes settled on Lenora in her wheelchair, he saw not a victim but a witness, someone whose testimony would be crucial to determining the truth. "Mrs. Gentry," Judge Blackwood said, approaching her with the careful respect due to someone who had suffered greatly, "I understand you have testimony to give regarding your husband's alleged crimes." "I do, Your Honor." Lenora's voice remained steady, though she felt the weight of this moment, the culmination of months of preparation and healing. "I can testify to the theft of town funds that I discovered before my abandonment, and I can describe in detail how Sheriff Gentry attempted to murder me in the desert." Amos finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and desperate. "Your Honor, this is all a terrible misunderstanding. My wife has been through a traumatic experience, and I fear it may have affected her memory." "Sheriff Gentry," the judge interrupted sharply, "you will have your opportunity to respond to these allegations in due course. For now, I suggest you remain silent and listen carefully to what is being said." The formal proceedings that followed were methodical and devastating. Lenora's testimony was clear, detailed, and unshakable. She described discovering the altered ledger entries, her husband's growing desperation, and the calculated cruelty of her abandonment. Her words painted a picture of systematic betrayal that left no room for alternative interpretations. Thaddeus Cole, called forward as a witness despite his obvious discomfort with public speaking, corroborated her account with his own observations. His description of watching the abandonment through his spyglass, his decision to intervene, and his months of caring for Lenora in his mountain sanctuary added crucial details that supported her version of events. "I saw him leave her to die," Thaddeus said simply, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he faced the judge. "Saw him ride away without looking back, like she was nothing more than something to be discarded." Dr. Henley presented his medical observations, pointing out the inconsistencies in the supposed accident that had first aroused his suspicions. The marshal read Jakob Kowalski's deathbed testimony, providing independent verification of the abandonment from a witness who had no reason to lie. But the most damning evidence came when Judge Blackwood examined the hidden ledger in detail. The systematic theft it documented was undeniable: $18,437 stolen over 14 months, hidden in accounts under false names in distant towns. "Sheriff Gentry," Judge Blackwood said finally, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "you are accused of embezzlement of public funds, attempted murder, and fraud. The evidence against you appears overwhelming. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Amos looked around the room at faces that had once shown him respect and trust, now reflecting only disgust and betrayal. The careful lies that had sustained him for months were useless now, shattered by the testimony of witnesses he had never imagined existed. He began, then stopped. What defense could he possibly offer? How could he explain the gradual corruption that had led him to steal from people who trusted him, the desperation that had driven him to attempt murder, the months of lies that had followed? "I never meant for it to go so far," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "The money was supposed to be temporary, just until I could get back on my feet. And Lenora, I thought if she was gone, I could make it right somehow, pay everything back. By murdering your wife? Judge Blackwood's voice cut through his stammering explanation like a blade. By abandoning a disabled woman in the desert to die of thirst and exposure? Amos had no answer. The magnitude of his crimes, laid bare in the harsh light of legal scrutiny, was undeniable. Amos Gentry, Judge Blackwood pronounced, his gavel ready to fall. This court finds probable cause to believe you are guilty of the charges against you. You are hereby remanded into custody pending formal trial. The gavel fell. With a sound like thunder, and with it fell the last remnants of Amos Gentry's carefully constructed facade. 6 months after the dramatic confrontation in Red Mesa's meeting hall, the morning sun cast familiar shadows across the dusty streets of the Arizona Territory town. But the community that emerged into that golden light was fundamentally changed. From the one that had gathered in shocked silence to witness Lenora Gentry's return from the dead dot the new school sign outside the rebuilt schoolhouse bore fresh paint and a message that reflected the town's evolved understanding of education and inclusion. Red Mesa Community School, all children welcome. Beneath the main inscription, in smaller but equally clear letters, were the words L. Gentry, principal and serving every student with dignity and respect. Lenora sat in her modified wheelchair on the school's front porch, reviewing lesson plans for the day ahead. The wheelchair itself had become something of a marvel in the community, no longer the crude, uncomfortable device Amos had reluctantly purchased, but a carefully crafted piece of equipment that Thaddeus had designed and built with the help of the town's blacksmith and carpenter. The school itself had been transformed as well. Ramps now provided access to all areas of the building. Desks had been modified to accommodate students with various physical needs, and the curriculum had expanded to include practical skills alongside traditional academics. Most importantly, it had become a place where every child, regardless of ability, background, or circumstance, could find belonging and opportunity. Among her students were children who had never before been welcomed in formal education settings. Tommy Martinez, whose withered arm had previously marked him as different, now served as the school's most enthusiastic mathematics tutor. Sarah Beth Collins, whose struggles with reading had once been dismissed as simple-mindedness, had discovered a gift for art that illuminated the classroom walls with color and joy. Miss Lenora called out young Billy Henderson as he approached the school, his mother walking alongside him with obvious pride. "I finished reading that book you gave me. Can I have another one?" Lenora smiled, remembering when Billy had been too shy to speak above a whisper in class. The transformation in these children mirrored our own journey from victim to survivor to someone who could help others find their strength. "Of course, Billy. I have several new books that I think you'll enjoy." As the children filed into the school, Lenora caught sight of a familiar figure approaching from the direction of the mountains. Thaddeus Cole rode his faithful mule Jeremiah down the main street, drawing respectful nods from townspeople who had come to know and appreciate the quiet mountain man who had saved their former teacher's life. Thaddeus had not returned to his complete isolation after the trial. Instead, he had found a middle ground maintaining his canyon sanctuary while also accepting a role as the town's unofficial guardian. His knowledge of the surrounding territory, his skills as a tracker and hunter, and his quiet moral authority had made him invaluable to a community learning to distinguish between real danger and imagined threats. "Morning, Lenora," he said, dismounting near the school steps. "Thought you might want to know. The territorial governor's representative will be arriving next week to review the new education programs. Word is that what you've built here is attracting attention in the Curtis capital. Good attention, I hope. The best kind. They're talking about using Red Mesa as a model for other frontier schools, showing that education doesn't have to be one size fits all, but communities can adapt to serve everyone." Lenora felt a deep satisfaction at his words. The work she had built here, rising from the ashes of Amos's betrayal, was helping to change lives far beyond Red Mesa's borders. "Any word from the territorial prison about?" she began, then stopped. Even now, months after his conviction, speaking Amos's name felt like acknowledging a darkness she preferred to leave behind. "He's serving his sentence without incident," Thaddeus said gently. 25 years for attempted murder, theft, and fraud. The money that could be recovered has been returned to the town's development fund." Lenora nodded. Justice had been served, not through vengeance, but through the proper application of law. Amos would spend the rest of his productive years paying for his crimes, while the community he had betrayed continued to grow and thrive without him. The school bell rang, calling her to the day's work. As Thaddeus prepared to continue on his rounds, checking on the outlying ranches and mining claims that looked to him for protection and guidance, he paused to watch Lenora wheel herself up the ramp into the schoolhouse. Thought the woman who had once been abandoned in the desert to die had not merely survived. She had transformed her suffering into purpose, her trauma into strength that lifted others. The wheelchair that might have been seen as a symbol of limitation had become a testament to the power of adaptation and determination. "Children," Lenora's voice carried through the open school windows as she began the day's lessons. "Today we're going to learn about resilience. Can anyone tell me what that word means?" A dozen hands shot up eagerly, each child wanting to share their understanding. In their bright faces and enthusiastic responses, Lenora saw the future she and Thaddeus had helped to create, a future where worth was measured not by physical ability or social status, but by the content of character and the strength of spirit. Outside, Thaddeus mounted Jeremiah and headed toward the mountains, Sarah's locket warm against his chest, but now it carried a different meaning than it had for 20 years. Instead of being a reminder of failure, it had become a symbol of second chances, of the possibility that even the deepest wounds could heal when met with courage and compassion. The desert stretched endlessly around Red Mesa, beautiful and merciless as it had always been. But the community that had taken root in its harsh embrace had learned something valuable about survival. That true strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from facing it with dignity, supporting one another through the difficult times, and emerging from trials not merely intact but better than before. As the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, the sounds of learning and laughter drifted from the schoolhouse, carrying across the desert wind like a promise that hope could flourish even in the most unlikely places.